It's not fair that Donald Trump continues to publicly call on Ukraine and not Russia to make concessions for the sake of peace. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelenskyy stated this in an interview with Axios. According to him, Trump has claimed twice recently that the responsibility for making concessions lies with Zelenskyy. However, the Ukrainian leader is confident that his people will reject a peace agreement with Russia if it requires a unilateral withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from Donbas and the transfer of this entire region to Russia.
Emotional people will never forgive this. They will never forgive me. They will not forgive the United States either. This is part of our country, our citizens, our flag, our land. I think that if we write in the document that we remain where the lines of contact are, people will support this in a referendum. That's my opinion. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, President of Ukraine.
No one can guarantee Ukraine that the Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin will not invade again. That is why Kiev requires strong security guarantees from its international allies, Volodymyr Zelenskyy stated in an interview with British journalist Piers Morgan. As of today,
no one can give us, with all due respect to the powerful American president and to America, a truly firm promise. I mean, America is a strong country, and we need its security guarantees. But even having all this, no one can tell us or promise us that Putin will not come again. We need strong security guarantees that the rest of the world or certain countries will be ready to respond to Putin if he returns with his aggression. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, President of Ukraine.
Iho Popov, an expert from the United Ukraine Center, is joining the broadcast. Mr. Popov, welcome.
Good afternoon.
When does Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy make statements in the Western media? For the Western audience, it is important to pay attention to the platforms he chooses to spread certain narratives. Right now, we are talking about an interview with the American news outlet Axios, in which he essentially criticized Trump's policy, which involves putting pressure on Ukraine during the negotiation process. In your opinion, for what purpose might the Ukrainian president have chosen to appear in this media and make this statement?
It was, after all, a soft criticism. That is, in the interview, the president thanked Donald Trump for his position, for his assistance, for moderating the negotiations. But at the same time, he made suggestions that indeed pressure should be increased on the aggressor state that started this war. Because Ukraine declares that it is ready for many compromises, it is making many painful compromises. But these compromises, first and foremost, they must not go beyond, once again, the national security of Ukraine. And secondly, I repeat, they must be mirrored by the Russian Federation.
How do you personally interpret this public rhetoric from Donald Trump aimed at increasing pressure specifically on the Ukrainian side in the negotiations? What interests might he be pursuing when he makes such statements?
Trump's style is like a pendulum. That is, sometimes he applies pressure, then he backs off, sometimes he sets deadlines, then he moves them, or cancels them altogether. Those who have studied his behavior as a developer, as a businessman, say that he conducted business negotiations in exactly the same way, whether he was buying land or selling skyscrapers. And that's why we see that at this stage, there is indeed a more active push to force Ukraine to make concessions. Even though it was only just a few weeks ago, we were discussing the various reports of how the American military is currently arresting Russian oil tankers or something like that. Trump is now negotiating directly with the Indian leadership in order to limit their purchases of Russian oil. And so it seems that whoever brings better proposals to the table, which what's the mood? What is the international situation? I see that now Russia is once again offering its services for cooperation with Iran. On the eve of a possible war between the US and Iran, Russia may take enriched uranium produced in Iran and guarantee that this uranium will not be used to create nuclear weapons. In other words, it is making such concessions, but in exchange is asking for the American administration to increase pressure on Ukraine, again, the situation with China, The Russian leadership sees that for Trump, it is very important to change the balance in relations with China. And so, any concessions from Russia to the United States and the closing of certain opportunities for China on Russian territory, these are also presented by Russia as concessions to the American administration. And again, in exchange, they demand concessions on Ukraine.
Russian diplomacy, in particular the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Lavrov often refers to a concept he himself invented called the spirit of anchorage. Recalling the meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska, which took place after the inauguration of the American president, in your opinion, could the implementation of the agreements reached in Alaska include, in particular, this position of Trump exerting pressure on Ukraine, especially considering... Now, as you have mentioned, the Russians, on the other hand, are offering him a lot of money.
As a matter of fact, this spirit of anchorage formula in Russian propaganda has actually replaced what they previously called overcoming the root causes of the war. Those were also vague formulations. The Russian side does not clarify what exactly was meant by this spirit of anchorage. But it can be assumed that this was an unconditional demand to transfer control over the Donetsk and Luhansk regions to the Russian Federation, with the creation of some kind of demilitarized zone, a free economic zone, but still under the Russian flag. And also, perhaps, some changes in Ukrainian politics were discussed there, maybe not just the holding of snap elections, but some influence over who would participate and who would win. But this is not discussed publicly. And so, on the one hand, it is somewhat unpleasant for us to hear that something very specific was agreed upon in Anchorage. On the other hand, since nothing is being specified, it means there is a certain leeway in these negotiations. In other words, Russia will be able to present many different options as if this was exactly the spirit of Anchorage. And that is why Ukrainian diplomacy continues to fight for every point of the potential peace settlement.
Ihor Popovic from the United Ukraine Center was with us.